Hi all. Today we will be looking at British history in the first half of the 19th century, examining a series of radical movements that resulted not in a British Revolution, but instead in the institution of a series of wide-ranging reforms. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as Europe's premier power. The British Navy dominated the world's oceans, whilst British goods flooded into markets around the globe. This power brought few tangible improvements, however, to the lives of people who lived in Great Britain and Ireland. Rather, a combination of the increasing use of machinery to do work that once required skilled labour, and the return of 300,000 former soldiers to civilian life following the Battle of Waterloo, meant that unemployment in Britain between 1815 and 1820 skyrocketed. Rather than return home to a hero's welcome, many veterans were forced into lives of destitution and poverty, particularly those that had been injured and lost a leg or a hand during the war. What made the situation worse was that the British Parliament, under the control of the Conservative Party nicknamed the Tories, was filled with noble families who owned vast swathes of the British countryside. It was in the interest of these nobles that their goods, mostly grain, known in Britain at the time as corn for some reason, continued to fetch a high price, despite cheaper grain being available from abroad. In 1815, Parliament passed the so-called Corn Law, which artificially slapped a high import tax upon grain from abroad during times of price depression. As a result, the price of bread, a vital staple in the meals of the poor, rose, putting yet more pressure on their lives. There slowly began to develop a greater understanding of the systems of class that governed British society. The Tory nobles who defended the Corn Laws and ran Parliament were without a doubt the upper class, who looked to protect their ancient privileges. The factory and machine owners, known as industrialists, outside of Parliament, who were denied the right to vote yet increasingly held the wealth in the country, began to be referred to as the middle class. The middle class resented the Corn Laws as they were proponents of free trade and wished to dominate global trade with their products. The working class, before Karl Marx came along with his own definition, were defined not by its lack of ownership of the means of production, although this was certainly the case, but was defined by its poverty and its lack of access to parliamentary power. Whilst only 11% of the entire British population could vote, the situation was at its most unequal in northwest England. Northern England was the heartland of the Industrial Revolution in the country, with thousands of people from the countryside pouring into industrial cities such as Manchester or Liverpool to find work. Despite this, the burgeoning cities had no representation in Parliament whatsoever, as parliamentary seats were based on older boundaries which were drawn up at a time when Britain was a more rural society. A mass campaign began in the north to earn parliamentary representation, onto which issues such as the right for all men to vote were included. Radical speakers or agitators, such as the former farmer Henry Hunt, addressed and electrified large audiences with his speeches calling for massive parliamentary reforms. Matters came to a head in 1819 with economic conditions at their most desperate level. Local magistrates in the northwest of England wrote to London that the people there were increasingly unruly and under the sway of so-called demagogues such as Hunt. Local conservative forces in the region began training and drilling their own militias to keep the peace. These militias, which for some reason included cavalry regiments, were poorly trained and ill-disciplined, being made up of local shopkeepers and the sons of property owners. On the 16th of August, one militia was deployed in Manchester to watch over a Henry Hunt rally. The rally was attended by between 30 and 50,000 protesters who carried no weapons at all and indeed had been asked by Hunt to dress in their Sunday best. The protesters were crammed into an open field, surrounded by narrow streets on all sides. Upon seeing the rapturous reception Hunt received from the crowd, the militia, possibly drunk, charged in on horseback to arrest him, trampling and cutting down the crowd around them. 600 innocent people were injured and 18 killed. At Waterloo there was man-to-man, but there it was downright murder, said one veteran soldier who attended this rally. Today, the Peterloo massacre, as the event came to be known, is regarded as a cruel, outrageous attack on the poor by a rowdy, untrained force, but at the time the majority of journalists reporting on the event placed the blame on the protesters, who they considered to be radicals. The Tory government of Lord Liverpool warned the public that revolution was imminent and passed the infamous Six Acts. These new laws banned large gatherings and heavily cracked down on radical publications such as newspapers and journals. Speaking out against the government was to be punished by transportation to Australia. Radicals outside of the Parliament, as well as the so-called Whigs who sat in opposition to the Tories, attacked the Six Acts as barbarous, and thanks to a strong campaign, the Six Acts were largely repealed over the coming 2 years. In the 1820s, the British economy began to improve and workers were able to find new jobs. Whilst tensions lessened slightly in England and Scotland, they began to increase in Ireland, where, in 1823, the Dublin lawyer Daniel O'Connell founded the Catholic Association in order to give Catholics the same rights as Protestants enjoyed in the country. O'Connell brought together thousands of poor Catholics in large open-air rallies, and brought energy and vigour to both the Catholic and the Irish nationalist causes. In 1828 and 29, under the leadership of the Napoleonic War hero, the Duke of Wellington, the Tories relented and passed laws giving rights to both Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants, who were known in Britain as dissenters. Throughout the Regency era of the 1810s and into the 1820s, Britain had been ruled by King George IV, a fat and vain man, more interested in architecture and partying than he was in ruling. The institution of the monarchy was weakening at the same time as it grew increasingly unpopular. In 1830, George IV died at the same time as Wellington's government had split between ultra-Tories, who opposed Catholic emancipation, and the general's increasingly small circle of supporters. During the election held that year, a series of radicals challenged the government to enact reforms and allow the middle classes to vote. The Duke of Wellington refused to change the corrupt constitution and reform the parliamentary constituencies known as rotten boroughs. Indeed, he told Parliament explicitly that he would resist reform measures for so long as he held any political power. 2 weeks later, Wellington was forced to resign, and the Whigs came into power under Earl Grey, promising extensive reforms. The Whigs proposed an electoral reform bill that would clean up the rotten boroughs and extend voting rights to the richest members of the middle class. This so-called Great Reform Bill was passed in the British lower house, the House of Commons, but was defeated in the House of Lords, the British equivalent of the US Senate. Unlike the House of Commons, the House of Lords was not elected, and indeed members of the Lords remain unelected, to this day. After the Lords rejected the Reform Bill, Wellington was returned to power. What followed was the closest Britain has ever come to a revolution. Violence and rioting erupted throughout the country, especially in the cities of London, Derby, Leicester, Yeovil, Sherborne, Exeter, Bath, and Worcester. The worst violence of all was seen in Bristol, where over 100 people died and the centre of the city was entirely destroyed in fires and in looting. The situation was rescued by the Whigs with the unlikely help of the portly and boring King William IV. At the behest of the Whigs, William threatened the House of Lords that, if they did not accept the Reform Bill, he would flood the Lords with numerous newly created Lords who would do his bidding and get the measures passed. This threat worked and the Reform Bill was passed. The middle class, at least the powerful industrialists and entrepreneurs, were brought into power and the violence on the streets diminished. The Whigs, who now dominated Parliament due to their middle class support, proceeded to enact a series of wide-ranging reforms. These reforms represented prevailing middle class liberal ideology at the time, being focused on liberty, self-help, and commerce at the expense of the older Tory ideals of maintaining the established social order and respecting tradition. Slavery, for example, was abolished in 1833 after a bitterly fought campaign. Attempts were also made to improve the lives of the poor, who still lacked the right to vote. Child labour, endemic in large cities such as London and Manchester, was limited. Children under the age of 12 could now only work for 8 hours a day. Teens were limited to 12-hour shifts. The Poor Law of 1834 was heralded as a great step in the improvement of the lives of the poor, as it provided government welfare to the most destitute. However, under the Whigs' liberal morality, the poor would have to work for this assistance to ensure that they remained morally upstanding subjects and contributors to society. The belief at the time was that if welfare was provided to alleviate suffering, the poor would have more children, and thus the cycle of poverty would continue. As a result, welfare recipients were forced to labour in large factory buildings called workhouses. Conditions in the workhouses were deliberately made as brutal as possible to deter any but the truly desperate from applying for welfare. The workhouses would become a symbol of fear and oppression over the following decades, and to be sent to one was seen as little better than starving to death on the streets. Workhouses did not disappear from British cities until 1948. The horrors of the workhouse were omnipresent during the 1830s and 40s, a decade that has gone down in history as the Hungry Forties due to a series of poor harvests and high grain prices. A potato blight made famine endemic throughout Europe, but nowhere was it worse than in Ireland. Ireland was a rich agricultural island which produced far more than just potatoes, but the vast majority of food in the country was sold to Great Britain by greedy British landlords. The poor farmers who worked for the absentee landlords or owned small plots themselves were entirely dependent on the potato crop, and when this failed, mass starvation killed approximately 1 million Irish. The desperate Irish appealed to the Tory government in Westminster, which finally abolished the Corn Laws and sent over nearly inedible cornmeal for the Irish population to eat. Even this was considered by many in Britain as too much, and the Tories were replaced by the Whigs, who, under the liberal principle of free market capitalism, refused to intervene in Ireland at all. Not only would no assistance come from London, but, horrifically, exports of food from Ireland continued even at the height of the famine. The atrocious British response to the famine was such that, even today, the population of Ireland has yet to recover to pre-famine levels. Millions of Irish left to find new lives for themselves in the US, Canada, Australia, or in Britain itself, especially in the cities of Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. Some historians even consider that the famine was a genocide. Whether this is the case or not, the government's terrible response was undoubtedly conditioned by racism and ignorance towards the Irish. The famine would loom over and discredit British rule in Ireland for the following 70 years and continues to play an important part in Irish national memory today. Whilst their situation was hardly as bad as the Irish, the British poor also suffered from the high price of food in the 1840s. Moreover, while the Great Reform Act had created new voters, 80% of the male population were still ineligible to vote, to say nothing of women at the time. A mass movement sprung up calling upon poor Britons to sign a large petition to Parliament, the Charter, giving them a right to vote. The Chartists, as they were known, gained in popularity whenever the years of famine were particularly acute. An Irishman, Fergus O'Connor, led much of the movement with his fiery speeches. He formed a so-called land plan to give land to working-class people so that they would be able to vote. The Chartists' final petition contained millions of signatures. It was carried by working-class people in person to London, where it was subsequently rejected by the Parliament. Yet despite this rejection, no mass revolution broke out in Britain as it did in France, and the Chartists dispersed. Despite a series of smaller reform acts, universal male suffrage did not emerge in Britain until as late as 1918. To conclude, the history of Britain and Ireland in the first half of the 19th century tells us two things. Firstly, the British government was able to reform and pass laws to moderate the masses when its counterparts in Europe were unable to do so. This meant that the United Kingdom never experienced a revolution once in its modern history. Secondly, the reforms that were passed by the British Liberals, the Whigs, were not necessarily moral or good. It was these very reforms which pushed thousands into miserable conditions in the workhouses and allowed employers to treat their staff with utter disdain. Perhaps worst of all, it was free market economic policies that exacerbated a famine in Ireland into one of the worst human tragedies Europe has ever experienced. Rather than learn their lesson, British elites would continue to economically exploit their colonies, and similar famines with even higher death tolls would follow in British India.